Good morning. It's great to see you. If you've never met, my name is Jay, and I'm part of the team here. Welcome to Westgate South Hills. We're so glad you're here. I want to start by showing you a picture, a 19th century picture of a man that 99% of you in this room will not recognize, but that's okay. This is a man named Charles Blondin. And how many of you guys know Charles Blondin or are fans of Charles Blondin? Have a poster of Charles Blondin in your bedroom when you were growing up? Anybody? Okay, that's because you didn't grow up in the 19th century. But in the mid to late 19th century, Charles Blondin was like one of the most famous people on the planet. He was at the time, and still to this day, considered one of the greatest tightrope artists of all time. This is him actually traversing the Niagara Gorge, which leads to the Niagara Falls. And in the 1850s and 1860s, Charles Blondin crossed the Niagara Gorge like hundreds of times. And he did this without a safety net. In fact, he was famous for saying that if he had a safety net, it'd be more dangerous because he would be too distracted, that he would sort of let go in his mind of the pressure and not focus as much, knowing that if he fell, he'd get caught by this safety net. And so he always crossed the gorge with no safety net. He did this, again, hundreds of times. Several times he actually pushed a wheelbarrow across a tightrope. Once, I don't even know how this works, there's no photographs of this. Once he actually crossed the gorge on a tightrope on stilts. I don't know how he did that. One of the first times he ever crossed the gorge, there was actually a boat that was on like a party of people who were watching him from the river. And he laid down on the rope, and they tossed a glass and a wine glass and a bottle of wine up to him. He caught both and had himself a glass of wine while laying on the tightrope. I mean, Charles Blondin, you guys, he was like the man when it comes to tightrope artistry. Now, some of you, even though you don't know the name Charles Blondin, you probably know this story because it's actually a famous anecdotal story, but it's actually a true story from Charles Blondin's life. At one point, because like tens of thousands of people would come out to watch Blondin cross on a tightrope across the Niagara Gorge. And once, after crossing several times, he looked out at this massive crowd and he says, "How many of you believe that I can cross on this tightrope with somebody on my back?" And everybody roars, right? Everyone cheers, "You can do it, Charles!" And then he asks the second question, "Which one of you will get on my back?" Just silence, utter silence. This is the difference between the way we understand the word faith today and what the Bible actually means when it talks about faith. Most of us believe that if you have faith, you have an intellectual belief in something that is true or possible. In other words, most of us today believe that faith is like the crowd cheering Charles Blondin on, telling him, "We believe you can do it, Charles." But when the Bible talks about faith, the Bible is asking one question further. When the Bible talks about faith, the Bible is asking the question, okay, so who will then get on my back and cross? This is the difference. Most of us think faith is an intellectual belief, but when the Bible talks about faith, the Bible is actually talking about not intellectual belief, but one step further. The Bible is talking about what I would call embodied trust. It is a willingness to act upon that which we say we believe. Most of us think that faith means being the crowd, cheering Charles Blondin on, "You can do it." When the Bible talks about faith, the Bible is asking the question, which one of you will actually get on my back and actually do it? I start here because for the last several weeks, we've been in this journey through a brand new teaching series on the life of Abraham. And we're calling this series A Field Guide to Loving God. And the reason is, at Westgate, one of our core values is the value of becoming a people who deeply love God. And that phrase, loving God, is a little bit ambiguous because both the words love and God are malleable in culture today. We use the word love to describe all sorts of things, and the sort of semantic range of the word has been stretched to its limits. This is why you often hear the joke that we say, I love my children and I love tacos, right? It's because the semantic range has been stretched. And so what we're doing in this series, we're exploring what does the Bible actually mean when it talks about loving God? And then we're talking about God himself. Like, who are we talking about when we say we want to become people who love God? And today, as we sort of continue on in this journey, what we want to do is ask the question, what does Abraham's life teach us about, first, what faith actually is, and second, how faith and living embodied trust with God is a means of loving God? Because this is exactly what Abraham does. In fact, the story of his life, at least in the Bible, begins with a step of faith. In other words, not intellectual belief, but a step of embodied trust. In fact, let me read for you the very beginning of Abraham's story. At this point in the story, his name is actually just Abram, and God will change his name to Abraham a little bit later. But this is Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 through 4. This is our introduction to Abraham, or Abram, in the story. The Lord had said to Abram, "Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you I will curse, and all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." So Abram went. Now, many of us know this story, and because we are familiar, we miss how giant a leap of faith Abram actually takes here. You notice the words that I've highlighted in the text. First, God says to Abram, "Go." And then God says, not just any place, but to the land I will show you. And then the story tells us Abram went. Go to the land I will show you. Abram is essentially here walking out on a tightrope of faith. Why? Because the word go is in the present tense. The phrase, I will show you, is in what? That's right, the future tense. And this is the tension of faith, always, you guys. Always. This is always the tension of faith. The tension of faith is in the tenses. The reason a life of faith is so difficult, the reason a life of faith is so challenging, is because faith, by its very nature, is a walk across the tightrope. And the tension of the rope is built upon the difference between the present tense and the future tense. Always. This never changes. This is always how God calls his people to express faith, embodied trust. We stand in the present tense. God gives us a direction in the future tense, and it is our calling to step out onto the tightrope of faith. This is always the tension of faith. It's always between the tenses. The fact that we live in the present tense, God is calling us into the future tense, and we have a choice, always, whether or not to walk out on that rope with him. And what does Abram do? The story tells us Abram went. Abram walks out on that tightrope of faith. In fact, later in the New Testament, in Hebrews chapter 11, and we'll kind of trek through Hebrews 11 here together in a moment. But some of you know Hebrews chapter 11 as like the hall of faith. People will call it that because all of that chapter, Hebrews chapter 11, the entire chapter is story after story of people, particularly from the Hebrew scriptures, from the Old Testament, who exemplified this sort of faith. Not people who intellectually believe certain things about God, but people who expressed embodied trust in God as an expression of their love for God. just person after person. And Abram, or Abraham, is one of the main people highlighted in Hebrews 11. Here's what it says. Hebrews 11, verse 8 says that by faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. You see what Abraham did. He lived in the tension of the tenses. He lived in the present tense. He heard God's instruction and command and invitation in the present tense, go. He felt the tension of the fact that God said, go to a place I will show you, future tense. And Abraham, as Hebrews 11 tells us, he went. He obeyed and went, even though he didn't know where he was going. This is a part of the way Abraham expresses his love toward God. It is an embodied trust that even though Abraham did not know where he was going, he trusted that God knew where he was sending him and that God's posture toward him was one of love. And so his response to God's love was to love God in return. And the way he did that was not just to feel butterflies in his stomach or to have intellectual assent toward a set of beliefs, but rather in his entire being to take himself and in embodied trust take steps toward the direction that God was calling him, even though he didn't know. He trusted that God knew and that God loved him, and therefore, because God loved him and God knew, Abraham knew that his response of love was to go. Make sense? He lives in between the tension of the tenses, and he goes where God is calling him to go. Now, this sort of faith, a willingness to go without knowing, essentially, is antithetical to a very powerful and specific cultural value today. It's the cultural value of what you and I would call, and what pop culture calls, following your heart. We are drowning in this idea that the best life you could ever experience is the sort of life where you just follow your heart. You know where this phrase came from? Some of you know the name Joseph Campbell. He was a writer, a 20th century writer. He's famous for having scripted what many people call the hero's journey. A lot of that work is really helpful, but in an interview in 1985 with Bill Moyer, Joseph Campbell said this. He said, if you follow your bliss, if you put yourself on a kind of track that has been there all the while waiting for you, and the life that you ought to be living is the one you are living. Wherever you are, if you are following your bliss, you are enjoying that refreshment, that life within you all the time. Joseph Campbell said this in 1985, and shortly after, it was such a popular quote, so shortly after, they wanted to make it a little bit more catchphrasy, and so they turned the word bliss into your heart, because essentially they're synonymous, culturally speaking. Bliss is like that feeling, that like energizing, butterflies in the stomach, feel-good sort of experience. And so they just whittled that down to the word heart, and hence now, today, we hear this phrase all the time. Follow your heart. But I would suggest to you that following your bliss or following your heart is actually terrible life advice. And here's why. Your heart, and this is not a popular thing to say, but I'm going to say it. Your heart is deceitful. Your bliss, the stuff that makes you feel good, the stuff that makes you so happy in the moment, it's deceitful. I mean, Jeremiah chapter 17 says it just outright. The heart is deceitful above all things. Listen, if I followed my bliss, if all I ever did every waking moment of every day was the stuff that makes me feel good in the moment, my marriage would end, my kids would disown me, I couldn't work at this church, I couldn't be a part of a church. Church doesn't always feel good. I couldn't be a part of real meaningful community. I mean, just think about that. If all we ever did was follow our bliss or follow our heart, if physically, you know what would happen to me, you guys? I would eat donuts and onion rings every meal. if I just followed my bliss. In fact, even just saying it, the flesh in me is tempted to live that way. This morning, right here on Almaden Expressway, I went to Starbucks to grab myself an iced coffee before coming in here to South Hills, and there's a donut shop right next to you guys. The bliss in me, the heart in me was just like, go, Jay, get yourself a maple bar with cream. Like everything in me was like, no, right? I mean, you know exactly what I'm talking about. And this like plays out in ways that are far more dangerous than just the food we eat. I mean, this is literally why relationships break down and disintegrate. This is why marriages, when they end, always, what you hear is that same phrase like, oh, the spark is gone. You know what I'm saying? Like, is that what marriage is? Is that what we committed to? Just chasing after sparks? Because the reality is, if that's true, no relationship will ever survive. Following your heart or following your bliss is terrible life advice. Now, this does not mean that emotions and feelings are bad. They're good. They're God-given. But this does mean that motivations grounded in self-interest and the pursuit of simply feeling good are utterly deceitful. And this is not the way God calls us to live our lives. And most importantly, even if you're not a Christian, I would tell you this. This is not the path that leads to flourishing, to a life of meaning and a life of purpose. This is why the happiest, and when I say happy, I don't just mean like feel good. I mean the people who are most grounded in deep joy are not the people who live for themselves. They're the people who give their lives away for the benefit of others. And what we see in Abraham's life and in the life of his wife Sarah, not perfectly, they falter and fail all the time, but what we see in their life is a model for how to live a life of faith and how to live a life that leads to joy and flourishing, and most importantly, how to live a life that leads to love from God and a return of love toward God that is antithetical to this cultural concept of following your heart. We see this over and over again, and we'll deep dive into this in the next couple of weeks as we continue journeying through Abraham's life. But I just want us to look at this short passage from Hebrews chapter 11, and it reveals to us what faith looks like and how we can walk that tightrope of faith in such a way that we live a life of real love toward God, of receiving His love and returning that love back to Him. A life of faith, a life of embodied trust. First, what we see is that Abraham embraces the place of faith. And the place of faith is always here, not there. Let me show you. Again, Hebrews 11, verse 8. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. This is the same thing we've been talking about. The place of faith, where faith actually takes place, is never tomorrow. It is always today. Some of us live our lives and we think to ourselves, well, today is today, but tomorrow is the day that I begin. Faith never works that way. Faith is always in the present tense. It always happens right now. It's always a calling from God to us to live with embodied trust, to walk out on the tightrope today, right here, right now, before tomorrow reveals itself. This is faith. In its very nature and essence, this is how faith works. Faith is not faith if you are waiting for just a little bit more information, a little bit more data, a little bit more this, a little bit more that, a little bit more assurance from God. That's not how God works. The place of faith is always here, never there. This is why Abram doesn't ask questions. He doesn't doubt. Doubt is a normal part of the life of faith, but here what we see is this quintessential idea that faith is always here. That's the place of faith. In the present tense, taking a step in embodied trust. We also see that Abraham embraces the way of faith, which is always through, not around. Listen, often when we see that tightrope before us, what we'd like to do is say, okay, there's got to be another way across this river. Like, I understand God is asking me to go out on the tightrope, but that guy has a boat. I just like hop into that boat. That just feels safer. It still gets me where I need to go, to the other side, but like that, I just feel like that's probably a little bit safer. I'm really guilty of this, you guys. I try to plan out in my head every possible scenario in such a way that I can minimize risk. And sometimes I have these moments when God makes it abundantly clear, you're missing the entire point, Jay. You're trying to minimize all the risk, but the point is not to get to the other side. The point is to experience the exhilaration of a life lived out on the tightrope. Not because we're thrill seekers, but because that's where God shapes us the most. It's because we cannot be formed into the people of God, the people who lean on God fully and completely, who entrust our entire lives to Him, unless from time to time we put ourselves in a position where we have nothing but Him. We try to live our lives so safely that we get to the end of our lives and we realize that our stories don't exude and exemplify the sort of life of faith that we so often applauded from the safety of the crowd. It's like you get to the end of your life and you realize day after day you stood on the shore and you cheered Charles Blondin on, but you never ever stepped out on the rope yourself. But it's out on the rope that God does His work. You have to go through, not around. Abraham does this. Hebrews 11, verse 9. By faith, Abraham made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. Let's just stop there. That sentence makes no sense. He made his home in a land like a stranger in a foreign country. What? Those two things are paradoxical. Nobody feels at home in a foreign country where you feel like a stranger. You cannot feel at home and like a stranger at the same time. Those two don't coexist, except they do. Because this is how God forms and shapes us. When we make the decision to step in and to make our home in places that feel utterly foreign. In those moments when we realize we have nothing but God. But if we have God, we have all we need. And though we exist and live and traverse through a foreign land like a stranger, with God, we are always home. Does this make sense? Home is not a place. It is not a culture. It is not a particular environment. It's not a particular socio-political environment. It's not because our country is making this decision or that decision. For the Christian, home is always where God is with you. And for the Christian, God is always with you. And you are always home. You're always home. Even if you feel like a stranger in a foreign land. This is how we gain the confidence and courage to walk out onto the tightrope. Because we realize that's actually the safest place to be. If God is with us, that is the safest place to be. Abraham and his wife Sarah, they also embrace the timing of faith, which is always about God's timing, not my timing. You know the story of Abraham's wife Sarah. Hebrews 11:11. By faith, even Sarah, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children. We'll get more into this story later in the series. There's no way for us to know or understand God's timing. I mean, the Bible tells us that with the Lord, 1,000 years is like a day is like 1,000 years. You know those types of stories and verses, right? Like COVID has done this to us in a weird way. Like the last 18 months, don't they feel like they've been the longest 18 months and the shortest 18 months at the very same time? And in fact, it feels so much like that, the phrase 18 months doesn't even mean anything to us anymore. You know what I'm saying? You're just like, I don't know what that is. Months, years, days, hours, minutes, seconds, it's just all a blur. With God, this is how it works. Time is like God exists outside of time and space. He enters into time and space with us, but he also exists outside of time and space. And so to believe that the God of the universe would do everything with pinpoint accuracy based on our timing preferences is foolish and it's prideful. God's timing is God's timing, not our timing. Sarah and Abraham learned this firsthand. And finally, Abraham and Sarah, they embrace the object of faith. The object of faith, which is God, no one and nothing else. And this is an obvious one. God is the object of our faith, no one and nothing else. We are able to walk out, traverse out into the risky, dangerous reality of the tightrope because God is with us. The second half of Hebrews 11:11. Sarah bears these children even though she was past childbearing age because she considered him, God, faithful, who had made the promise. She didn't receive the gift of her son Isaac because, she believed in modern medicine. And there wasn't such a thing back then. She believed and considered God faithful. So that's the question for us. Do we consider God faithful? So in Abraham's life, Hebrews 11, what we see is that Abraham embraces the place of faith, here, not there, the way of faith, through, not around, the timing of faith, God's timing, not our timing, and the object of faith, which is God himself and no one and nothing else. So I want to ask you a question as you think about this week, living this out this week. What is one thing that is out on the tightrope of your life that you sense God has been asking you, hey, will you get on my back and go? What's one thing? This past week, I was with my life group, and one of the guys in my group, he shared something with us that was so profound. It was so simple, but so profound, and it was a step of faith. He talked about how he wanted to be a better father and specifically a better husband to his wife. And so in our group, we're sharing, and he says to our life group, there's this thing I've been trying to do. I printed out this sheet of commitments I can make to my wife every single day. And they were so simple. One of them was, say nothing negative to your spouse today, only positive. It was such simple things. And he said, I've been trying to do this, but I've been putting it off. All I've done is print out the sheet, and it's sitting on my bathroom, in the bathroom. It's just taped there. And my wife can see it too, so she knows I'm not doing it, And so he asks us in the life group, he says, would you guys keep me accountable? And so, before we can even keep him accountable, the very next day, he emails all of us, and he says, man, I failed again. I got up, I brushed my teeth, I saw what I was supposed to do that day, and I just got too lazy, and I got too nervous, and I didn't do it. Now I'm at work emailing you guys for accountability, letting you know that I failed. And some of the other guys emailed back, and they said, man, first of all, thanks for your honesty, but secondly, you can do this. You can do this. And one of the guys said, dude, it's just one small step of faith at a time. And this guy didn't know I was preaching about a tightrope and taking steps out onto a tightrope. But when he wrote that, I just thought, yes, that's what faith looks like. Often we think faith means the big, grandiose decisions of life. And they are. Those are steps of faith too. But do not believe that you only are called to a life of faith in those moments when there are big, grandiose decisions. The reality is God is calling us out onto the tightrope of faith every moment of every day. So the question for us is, what is one thing that you sense God has been asking you to do, that you've been too nervous, too afraid, too unsure, too uncertain, too unsteady, too unequipped to do? And this week, would you, in love toward God, take one small step? That's what faith looks like. It's not just intellectually believing that God knows best, it's actually embodying the reality with your actions. In fact, if you're a part of a life group, I'd encourage you, just like my friend in my group, maybe ask for accountability. Share some of those things with your group. Say, here's one step I want to take this week. Would you hold me accountable? Now, I told you earlier about Charles Blondin, about that story where he stood out on the tightrope, he crossed the Niagara Gorge hundreds of times. He asks the people, how many of you believe that I can take a person on my back and we can traverse the tightrope together? And everybody cheers. And then he asks the question, who wants to get on my back? And it's utter silence. Here's what's really cool, you guys. After weeks and weeks of Charles Blondin asking the crowd over and weeks of not a single person volunteering, Blondin eventually convinces his manager, a man named Harry Colcord, to get on his back. And Harry Colcord, I'll show you a photo here, gets on Charles Blondin's back, and they traverse the Niagara Gorge together. Now, I want to read for you some words that were in a newspaper article that Charles Blondin said to Harry Colcord right before they went out on the road. Listen to this, so profound. Charles Blondin said to Colcord, "Look up, Harry. You are no longer Colcord. You are Blondin. Be a part of me, mind, body, soul. If I sway, sway with me. Do not attempt to do any balancing yourself. You do not traverse the tightrope of faith alone. You traverse it on the broad shoulders of a God who will never fail. Yes, it's risky. Yes, the nerves and the anxieties are real. But the reality is, there is a God who's carrying you, who will never fail you. And he will always get you home, safe and sound. This past summer, my wife and I took our two little kids, they're 6 and 3. We took them to Disneyland and California Adventure. And it was my son's first time, it was my daughter's second time. But the first time my daughter had been to Disneyland, she was really young. She was 2. And so, naps, and she had to be in bed early, all that kind of stuff. Well, this time, once it got to about 8 o'clock, 7 or 8 o'clock, we were there a couple days, and my wife would take our son back to the hotel because he needed to get to bed. He was that was always meltdown hour. So then Jenny would take Simon back, and then it was just my daughter, Harper, and I in the park, just the two of us. And she was all energy, ready to go. She closed the park out every night. We were there literally till the park closed. And the first night that we closed the park out, we're at California Adventure, and we go on the Little Mermaid ride for the 12th time that day, because that was her go-to. And I'm fiending excitement, oh yeah, there's Ursula again, or whatever. She's so into it. We were literally the last people on the ride. We ran over, and we're can we get on? Okay, you're the last one. They chain it up behind us. And so we go on the Little Mermaid ride for, seriously, it felt like the 12th time. I think literally it was the 4th time we'd been on it that day. And we go on, we're the last people, we get off, and the moment we get off and we walk back out into the park, it's dark. The lights are turning off. And the big Ferris wheel, they're shutting the light off. It's getting dark in California Adventure, and there's security guards standing around. It's no longer California Adventure. It's a place you're not supposed to be kind of feel. We're okay, well, Harper, I guess it's closed. We got to go back. And she's just beaming, grinning, right? Ear to ear. And she looks up at me and she says, "Daddy, thank you. That was the best." And I look at her and I say, "Yeah, this was so special, Harper. I was so glad to share today with you. Let's get back." How do we get back? I just wanted to see. How do we get back to our hotel? And I kid you not, here we are in the darkness of California Adventure, as it's like gloomy and scary now. All the lights are turning off and all the people are gone. And I imagine to myself, if she were here alone, she'd be frantic and crying. But with a smile from ear to ear, she looks up at me and she says, I don't know, Daddy. I don't know how to get back. But with this giant smile as wide as east is to west, you know what she said to me? She said, but Daddy, you know. You know. And we walked safely home. You may not know where your life is headed. In the darkness and uncertainty of your life, you could cave in to the fear and the uncertainty and anxiety. But if you would just lift your gaze and see the God of the universe, who loves you more than you could possibly know, looking down at you with love, you could, just like my little girl, in the darkness, look back up at him and say, I don't know, but Daddy, you know. You know. You know the way home. And so where you go, I will go. Let's pray together. Jesus, we love you. We thank you for coming and making a way for us to the Father. And in the uncertainty and the fear and the anxiety of our lives, and the invitation to walk out on that tightrope, may we lift our gaze and see you, God, our Father, smiling back at us, knowing that you love us more than we could ever know, and that with you we are always safe, always home, and that you'll always get us where we need to go. So we pray that today you would give us the strength and the courage and the confidence to take that one step out onto the rope, whatever that step is for each and every one of us, knowing that that's the best place to be because of your love for us. We love you. We pray these things, Jesus, in your name. Amen.